For people who are not familiar with your work, can you just give us a brief introduction to your theoretical approach and what you do?
Yeah, so as you say, I'm influenced by Henrik Grossman, who was a Polish Jewish Marxist who wrote a book called The Law of Accumulation and the Breakdown of the Capitalist System in 1929. It was published just before the Wall Street crash, when everyone else was saying that capitalism was in rude health. He turned out to be right in his predictions that it was about to undergo a massive breakdown. And basically, he's just the best defender of Marx that I've found, and the theories of that Marx lays out in Capital. And he draws out this breakdown theory from Marx's work, where he basically produces sort of simplified, pure versions of capital accumulation in like mathematical schemas or patterns, and he just follows them through to see where they go. To he allocates where the profit needs to go in terms of towards wages, towards profit, towards the consumption of capitalists, which is of course the incentive for being a capitalist. Um, Postulates a rate of profit and accumulation, and then follows it through. And basically, all that it shows is that capital at some point during the cycle of accumulation breaks down because there's a lack of or a shortage of value or surplus value that's being extracted from the working class that can then be converted into profit and capital. So at that point, a recession becomes inevitable. So all he's really showing is that recessions are inevitable in capitalism because you get this surplus of capital that just cannot be invested. It can't be profitably invested. It can't yield a profit sufficiently. So there's no point in investing it. So what I do is what I've been doing is saying, well, okay, this makes a lot of sense considering how many recessions and big recessions I've experienced in my lifetime. And does it, correlate with empirical data, and does it correlate with Marx's other, um, you know, sort of findings that socialism has to eventually replace capitalism? And if you look at the empirical data, I think obviously the big one that most people um, on the left know about is the falling rate of profit. And it doesn't just tend to fall, it tends to fall historically towards zero. So I think even if you can just grasp that, then you're halfway there, because it becomes pretty obvious that the closer we get to zero, the harder it is for capitalism to function. And the fact that it's a historical trend is obviously makes it very clear that it's can't last forever. The other main empirical facts or data that I've found that I think really back this up are the fact that more than half of the banks, because what happens is, in response to a crisis, you get a lot of obviously bankruptcies, and then you get mergers and acquisitions. So what capitalists do is they join forces to a certain extent to economize production, make it cheaper, achieve economies of scale. They can produce more commodities in less time, and therefore offset the rate of profit falling for a while by increasing the overall massive profit. So what happens is you essentially end up with fewer capitalists relative to the total amount of capital. So you get a centralization of wealth and capital. So what we see looking at this empirical data is that the number of banks in the US has more than halved just in the last 20 odd years. The same is true for the number of publicly listed companies. That's privately owned companies, but they're publicly listed on the stock exchange, so anyone can invest in them if they've got a bit of spare money. And the other thing is the largest or richest 500 companies on the S&P 500 stock exchange, the average lifespan has fallen from 60 years in the 1960s to around 15 years today. And that might actually be lower now, because that is from about 10 years ago. and I haven't found an update on that yet. So again, we see this sort of historical trajectory towards ever greater integration of production through ever greater mergers and acquisitions. And the way I formulated this is to say that quite simply, we're heading historically towards a final, what I call a final merger, where
Mhm.
it's just if that if that tendency continues, and there's nothing to suggest it won't, then we're heading towards a final merger that is historically and economically necessary. And the the thing about it that makes it all the more compelling is that it's happening at an accelerating rate. So almost the entirety of the merger and acquisition waves in the US have happened in the last 35 years. So yeah, I just basically you know, marry the Marxist theory with the empirical data, see if they're matching up, and they are. And the implication is of a final merger is that it has to be publicly owned, because in a total monopoly, there's no exchange of ownership, which makes capital and money historically obsolete.